am going to talk about, or started to research around board level strategic decision making, which was really about, what are the processes and characteristics that really put that decision making in a context within the boardroom. And the problem of practice I had is one that's probably all too familiar to too many of us today. And it really goes back to, if you look back here in the early 2000 time frame, and really it really goes back as much as 1980 to 1990, but it really kind of heightened itself into the 2000 time frame with all of a sudden Sarbanes-Oxley coming into the forefront, and the requirement to really put in place a lot of board reform around the area of really structural characteristics of the board and compliance issues centered around the board. And if you look at what a lot of those characteristics were around Sarbanes-Oxley, they really did deal with structural elements. Are there more independent members than dependent members? Gee, all of the three major committees, audit, compliance, or compensation, nomination, all have to be stacked with nothing but independent members of the board. Boards need to be more reflective of that. So this whole idea of board ties and that needed to be broken down. So a lot of structural issues were in place. And so that seemed to tell a lot of people, well, gee, this should solve a lot of our problems. And it didn't take us very long, other than a few years later, when all of a sudden all of these companies hit the front pages. And if you looked at these companies, I talked about that. Where did they go? If you looked at all of these companies, and what we really saw was that the issues were not about compliance issues. These were issues about strategy and risk, and managing strategy and risk within the boardroom itself. So, as we looked at this, what we ended up seeing was that this whole idea of what Sarbanes-Oxley did, by creating more independence meant there were less people on the board who really understood the business, because you couldn't hire people from your partners. You couldn't hire people who had long-term relationships with you. You couldn't hire people who were had some type of financial advantage. I remember Warren Buffett, when this first came out, he said, this is probably the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, this Sarbanes-Oxley. Now, he had his attorney on his board. His attorney got paid, I forget what Berkshire Hathaway pays, but it's one of the poorest paying boards there is. It pays like $20,000 a year to its board members. And his attorney was making millions of dollars a year as a partner in a law firm, but because he did over $100,000 a year with this law firm, all of a sudden his attorney was no longer independent. Right? So he kind of said, gee, does this really make sense? I have to now send one of my closest board members who understands my business for 30 years can no longer be involved in most of the board issues. Right? So all of a sudden you start getting that whole area of dysfunctionability. You start to bring in people who don't know each other, don't have those interrelationships, and it really starts to then break down a lot of the collaboration, less involvement with the board's ability to be able to engage on a strategy level. And that's, as I said, that's what we've really seen here. We're boards that were independent, but so independent that in many cases they lost sight of what the real performance was in the company from a risk performance standpoint, or how is it that the company's really performing. And so that became the issue. And that really then became the problem of practice that I decided to look at. And that is, how is it that boards can engage at the strategic level within the boardroom? Now, if you looked at the literature, interestingly, and I know many of you have done work on board research, what you'll find is that board research is if not the highest area of academic research and scholarly research, it's very, very close to it. It's amazing how much research has been done on the board level itself, on one hand. On the other hand, what we also see is that most of that research has really dealt with inputs over here which are really visible to shareholders. So they're things you can find in proxy statements or in the public press. And they generally deal with structural characteristics or environmental characteristics. And usually then what they do is they go over here and they analyze the outputs, and they then try to draw some type of causal inference between the two. And as you can see, there's a tremendous gap between the inputs and the outputs, and probably a whole lot of things that go on in between here. So despite all of the research that's been done, you know, every time that there's a meta-analysis done that pulls it all together, it all comes down to a head scratcher that says, gee, we really don't know what happens. Sometimes independence works well, sometimes independence doesn't work well. Gee, sometimes when the CEO is the chairman, we end up getting good performance. Sometimes when he's not the chairman, we end up getting good performance. Gee, sometimes when the board owns a lot of stock in the company performs well. Well, you know the rest of the story. So there really hasn't been a lot of ability to connect the two. And the reason for that, very simply, and it's been written about to a great extent, is that there's this tremendous black box that goes on within the boardroom. And this black box is all about the processes that go on within the boardroom. And a lot of scholars around this whole board area, Jay Lorsch, one at Harvard, he always talks about it in his books and in his presentations, is how come so many A people go on boards and end up creating D and F boards, right? So in other words, you look at the resumes of the people who are on General Motors, there's nobody on that board who was not a distinguished executive or lawyer or scholar or in some capacity held a very distinguished position and did very well in it. But somehow when that board gets together, they perform at a C, D, or an F level. That was the case at HP. It's the case over and over and over again. So what goes on between the A's that results in the F's over here? And what we see is it's really a tremendous amount of process work that goes on within that board. So that's what I was interested in trying to understand was what are the processes that go on to make strategic decisions in the board, and how do boards make strategic decisions? Now, one of the challenges in all of this is that, as you can well imagine, there are not a lot of boards who are willing to open the black box up and ask you and allow you to come in and talk to them about how they do business, for several reasons. Number one is the accountability issue. Secondly, there are legal issues associated with that also, right? They have a responsibility of duty of care and duty of loyalty. If we meet that, then it really doesn't matter how the firm does. As long as we do care and loyalty, we're done. If we make stupid decisions, well, we're covered under the bad decision as long as we do duty of care and duty of loyalty. So with that then, the challenge was getting inside some of these boardrooms and understanding this. And I have initially built a model more based upon my experience. I sit on 5 public boards and a couple of private boards where for organizations like the Carlyle Group and that. And so a little bit of a perspective of what goes on there, and I kind of had my own view that really said that, gee, this decision making was really driven by how vigilant are the boards. Some boards are, in fact, rather vigilant. Some of the people on the boards are vigilant, others aren't. Does the board take on an attitude of our job's to monitor it, or do we mediate and get in the middle of this thing? And then does the board have a short or a long-term view itself? And how does that affect strategic decision making? But at the end of the day, it's all about what are the norms within the boardroom, what are you allowed to do, and how much will the CEO let you peek in around the curtain to see what goes on? Because as much as you want to think that you're having a lot of involvement on the board level, it's only involvement up to the extent that the boardroom, that the CEO will let you see what's really going on in that company. So that's the way I approached it, and we went through a series of interviews with 9 publicly traded companies. All were traded on the NASDAQ. They were all in the high technology, small to medium tier. Why did I pick those? One is because I was looking at strategic decisions, and high technology companies are in a much more dynamic environment in terms of having to make decisions, and things are moving very quickly. So we had a lot of environmental dynamism that went on in that environment. Small and middle tier tend to lean on their boards more for help and guidance because they are resource constrained in terms of what they do. 31 interviews, tried to do 3 to 4 per board so that we could triangulate around what are these boards really saying. And then, of course, we did it through a comparative critical incidents interview process to really look at, first tell me what was an effective decision, and second tell me what was an ineffective decision, and work through it that way. So the findings, am I done? Oh. Oh, that's what this hand is doing. Gee, I was having such a good time in there.
I don't think so.
All right.
Problem is, now we can hear you.
That's what my wife says too. That's okay. All right. So what did we end up finding? It was a couple of things did come out interesting. First of all, everything I thought, and I didn't believe this, when Dick Bolin kept saying, draw a model, it really doesn't matter. Whatever you think now, you're not going to think when you're done. And I said, that can't be true, Dick. And my God, I've been doing this for years, so I know what's going on here, and it'll map out just the way I think it will. And it absolutely did not. And he was absolutely right. And what I came out of it were actually some interesting findings that surprised me to a great degree. And first of all, what we saw was that two boards, we asked the question, give me a description of what you felt was an effective or a high-quality decision. We didn't define what effective or high quality was. I left that up to them to tell me what they felt was a high quality or an effective decision. And what we ended up finding is that they split pretty much down the middle. Half of them, and we called these one half collaborative processes, the other expedient processes. And what it really boiled down to is that the collaborative process people were much, much concerned about making sure that everybody got their view on the table, that there was a consensus, that we worked to an answer. The expedient group was really what I really refer to more as a political process. Gee, let's get this thing wrapped up before we go into the meeting. In fact, one board member told me, gee, if we ever make a decision in a board meeting, we failed. That decision should have been done and we just ratify it in the board meeting. Right? And so what we ended up seeing was that when we looked at the board characteristics, there were some interesting findings. The first one was there's a lot of debate going on today about CEO duality. Should the CEO be the chairman, yes or no? Now, over in England and in Europe, that's not the case. Here in the United States, most of the Fortune 500 companies, something like 82% of them, the CEO is in fact the chairman. There was recent legislation that has not gone through, but recent legislation over the last kind of financial bust we went through that said, gee, we want to legally separate these two. Most of the reason was because of, gee, they're two different types of jobs. Well, what we found is there's really another point in it, and that was that in the collaborative boards, the chairperson was in fact independent. So all of the boards that acted in a collaborative way had an independent chairman. Those that did not acted in an expedient way. And what we found was that it's kind of intuitively makes a lot of sense. If I'm the CEO and I'm bringing a strategic decision to the board, I've already vetted that, worked it through my staff, so I'm not coming here for advice. I'm coming here because I want to sell my idea, get my resources, and go back to my team and get moving. And I can say that was always my approach when I was a CEO. That's what I was interested in doing. I mean, I used to go into every board meeting with, we have one objective, no action items. Just get this thing approved and move on, because these guys, they're just in our way, and gals. So anyway, that was there. Decision closure. Consensus was in the collaborative. These people tended to vote. Okay, so if we sit down, it would be a matter of, okay, we want to raise $30 million, let's discuss it, blah, 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 blah. Collaborative people, we're going to discuss it till we all feel comfortable about the decision. We either go or we don't go. The expedient, one CEO said very quickly, if I want to raise $50 million, if I get 4 votes and they're in favor and 3 are against it, we're going to go get $50 million. And the heck with the other 3 people. Right? Different attitude. And you kind of see this all the way going down in all of these in terms of where they were. And when we looked at this, board climate was really about, one was about respect, and the other one is about politics. And you heard that word all of the time. All of the time I heard from, why does your board work well? Because we have tremendous respect for each other. Why doesn't your board work effectively? They don't respect me. they don't respect 3 of us on this board. So respect became a big thing. Now what I then found as I started to go through my research is there's hardly anybody who has ever done any research on the construct or concept of respect. It's not out there. And a lot on trust, a lot on a lot of other things, but not on respect, even though we use the term all of the time. So as I've moved now to my quantitative research, it's kind of moved in a different direction. The back half is all about strategic decision making and the outputs that come out of strategic decision making at the board level. And what we see there is that this is really guided by some seminal work that was done by Forbes and Millikan in 1999, where they kind of laid out a theory for how process decisions are made within the boardroom. That was really confirmed during my research. That's an important part of what goes on there. Then the inputs became very clear in that it really kind of gets down to 2 things that are the characteristics. It's not all these structural things. It's really 2 things, and that is the board power that exists, the asymmetry of power that exists between the CEO and the board. Boards that are not asymmetric in their board power tended to be much more collaborative. Those that had asymmetries tended to be much more political. And then in addition to that, an important part is, do they have the expertise so that they can engage at a cognitive level and bring everybody into the table? And that's pretty much the model, with one very important exception, and that is what a lot of people haven't talked about is it's all about the board climate. What kind of climate gets created in that boardroom? And how do people interact within that? And what we're really guided by in this, as I've been going through the research, is some work that's been done by a professor, Tom Troy out of NYU, that really talks about procedural justice, which really gets down to a simple theory that says when people feel that there is justice in the decision process, that they're heard, that their issues are put on the table, that they're debated and they're brought to the forefront and they're able to participate in that, and that as a result of that they end up feeling respected in the process, being held in esteem in the process, then procedural justice has been done. And if procedural justice has been done, that typically drives a much higher level of pride in the organization, a much higher level of respect within the organization, and of course it solidifies the trust within the organization. And when that happens, then that causes people to be more psychologically engaged in the organization and to identify more with that organization, and as a result they then participate to a much higher degree. So that's the piece that we're working on through the quantitative part to be able to test that model. Thank you.